The mercenary sat across from a young woman at a modest table, studying her with quiet curiosity. Breaking the silence, he asked if she was the alchemist and, almost as an afterthought, requested her name. The girl replied in a measured voice, Alice. Jack's lips curled into a friendly smile as he extended his hand, offering a courteous greeting and remarking on how pleasant her name sounded. But instead of returning the gesture, Alice merely eyed his hand as though it were some strange insect that had wandered into her space. His grin faltered. He withdrew his hand with deliberate slowness, scratching the back of his head to mask his unease. Tilting her head slightly, Alice remarked that it was peculiar at first. She suspected her golem sensor was malfunctioning, but no, he truly possessed no mana at all. In her life, she had never met anyone like that. Jack, in all his glory, had apparently entered a world steeped in magic without a single drop in his reserves. With a groan, he dragged his palm down his face, admitting he'd meant to ask her about exactly that magic, mana, the works. Maybe she was the kind of expert who knew everything. Alice only shrugged, conceding that she might know a little here and there, before inquiring what he wished to learn. Jack's smirk returned as he said, it was a long story. He'd gotten himself into trouble, and now he needed a teacher. A few hours earlier, our hapless mercenary had been crouched inside the crumbling shell of a building, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Pressing the button on his walkie-talkie, he announced himself as the bomber and called for HQ to respond. A sharp beep answered him, followed by a voice on the other end asking what was happening. He reported that the chip was in his possession, but the enemy had shown up in full-force cars speeding in from all directions. Backup was needed. Urgently. There was a pause, then HQ's reply came, cold and unshaken. No reinforcements were coming. He was on his own. Abandoned mid-mission by his own side. How poetic. The mercenary's expression hardened as more headlights tore through the darkness toward the building. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle into the receiver, remarking that this was HQ's idea of gratitude. When he returned, someone was getting a fist to the face. Cutting the line, he ground his teeth, vowing silently that this betrayal wouldn't go unanswered. He wasn't some disposable piece they could discard. If they kept pushing, they might just witness his villain arc in real time. From his vantage point, he watched the enemy advance, still laughing to himself. They had put on quite the performance. Then, from somewhere in the ruins, the bomb he'd planted earlier began its warning beeps before erupting in a thunderous blast that sent shockwaves down the street, tossing cars like paper toys. His laughter turned wild, echoing through the empty building as he shouted to no one in particular that they should have seen the way those vehicles soared before shattering in midair. He was enjoying every second of the chaos right up until enemy soldiers stormed through the entrance, weapons drawn and faces grim. A sly grin spread across his face as he murmured under his breath, "Guess it's time to hand out their welcome present. Let's see how they like it." Slipping deeper into the shadows of the building, he moved with deliberate silence. The squad swept their sights across the area, tense and alert. One soldier suddenly shouted that the bomber was upstairs, but before they could advance, one unlucky step caught a rope hidden in the rubble. The trap sprang, and almost instantly a deafening blast hurled several of them to the floor. Jack had turned the place into his own twisted version of a home defense fortress, except his ornaments were live explosives. Panic rippled through their ranks as they scanned wildly for threats. The squad leader barked an urgent warning. Their target was a bomber, and every inch of the building could be rigged. Sliding on a gas mask, Jack flicked a small metal canister toward them with casual precision. "Time to sleep," he called out through the muffling filter. "The party's just starting. They don't call me the bomber mercenary for nothing. I'm not your guest." His voice darkened. "I'm the fireworks display." The canister hissed, releasing a choking cloud that spread with alarming speed. Soldiers coughed violently, eyes stinging as shouts of confusion echoed in the narrow hall. In seconds, the corridor became a wall of blinding haze. Somewhere in the mist, one man caught sight of Jack's silhouette and fired wildly, but every shot went wide, swallowed by the smoke. He cursed, looking around for Jack, but before he could react, the mercenary appeared beside him and put a bullet straight through his head. Jack ran down the hallway as the rest shouted after him, and the squad leader yelled not to let him escape because the chip had to be taken back no matter what. They chased him down the stairs, but one soldier stepped on a trap and another blast threw them off their feet. Jack had basically turned the whole building into a TNT party. One soldier shouted in panic, asking if there were landmines, and another growled about how much explosive stuff the bomber had planted. Jack jumped into a nearby van, started it, and sped off with a huge grin, yelling out the window that they'd need hundreds more men to kill him. He laughed like a maniac while the others screamed in frustration. Later, he stopped at a gas station, grabbed a cold soda from a vending machine, and drank it like someone who'd survived explosions and betrayal from his own HQ. Leaning against the van, he looked at the cracked mirror, thinking the ride was getting too much attention. Hard to stay hidden when your van smells like fireworks. He muttered to himself, wondering if it was finally time to ditch the van and maybe try hitchhiking for once. Not the best plan, but at least nobody could track a vehicle that didn't exist. Before he could act on it, a strange vibration pulsed beneath his boots. Glancing down, he spotted a glowing circle etched into the ground. He tried to step back, but his legs refused to move. In the next instant, the light flared, and the floor seemed to swallow him whole. Just like that, he'd been ice-guyed in the middle of a gas station. The mercenary crashed down in the heart of a colossal palace, its golden walls gleaming under a high ceiling, and its hall lined with towering statues. Blinking in disbelief, he turned to see armored soldiers forming ranks. Then, one after another, more people began appearing in bursts of light, each looking around in the same dazed confusion, like they'd been dragged into the world's strangest group trip. The air was thick with unease until a man in fine robes stepped forward, his commanding voice cutting through the noise. He welcomed them to a new world, introducing himself as Prime Minister Vilash. With grave formality, he explained that this land was unlike the one they had come from, and that they had been summoned for a purpose. The kingdom was locked in a desperate war against its neighbors, and they were to serve as its ultimate weapon. No longer strangers or outlaws whether they liked it or not, they were now soldiers. A boy in the crowd hesitantly raised his hand, confusion written all over his face, and asked if the Prime Minister truly meant they had been summoned to another world. Vilash snapped his fingers at the student, praising him as sharp, and confirmed he was exactly right. With a theatrical bow, the Prime Minister declared that from this day forward, they would be hailed as the kingdom's great heroes, its shield and sword in times of peril. Jack eyed the man warily, half convinced this was just some elaborate prank. Heroes from another world? It sounded ridiculous, and yet, here it was, all too real. Vilash then announced he would verify their abilities immediately. A glowing status screen shimmered into view before Jack's eyes. He gave a lazy shrug, muttering that in a world this strange, nothing was off the table. Skimming through the list of skills, his gaze paused on one marked translation B. That would explain why he could perfectly understand everyone here, even the Japanese kids. Useful, if a little unsettling. Then his eyes caught another entry, bomb making X++. The title alone radiated power, though he had no idea what the skill's full capabilities were. Still, it seemed this world had a certain fondness for having a human demolition expert in its ranks. The Prime Minister's eyes widened the moment Jack's profile appeared. His voice filled with awe as he said he had never seen an X-level skill before, much less a double plus. Without hesitation, Vilash ordered his guards to bring the thing. Moments later, they returned carrying a small, ornate box. Vilash presented the small box to the mercenary as though unveiling a priceless treasure, inviting him to inspect its contents. Jack lifted the lid and peeked inside, his mind instantly jumping to bomb-making supplies. Either this was a gift, or the most suspicious science fair project in history. The old man chuckled, clearly impressed that the bomber had guessed the purpose so quickly, and urged him to demonstrate what his skill could do. Jack sat down without hesitation, sorting through the materials and assembling an explosive with practiced ease. Minutes later, he announced it was finished, and strangely enough, he could see its specifications displayed before him. The Prime Minister leaned in, narrowing his eyes at what appeared to be a completely ordinary bomb. He remarked that the skill's effect seemed to be nothing more than ensuring a perfect success rate with every creation. That was it. Every boost simply guaranteed flawless crafting. Jack considered that surprisingly handy until Vilash's expression twisted into disgust. He exploded in anger, declaring the skill worthless since anyone could make bombs with enough training. The man had apparently chosen verbal warfare over basic courtesy. Turning toward His Majesty, Vilash asked for his opinion. The king's gaze lingered on Jack's status before he coldly pronounced him the only one among the new summons with absolutely no value. Laughter rippled through the hall as the crowd mocked the mercenary for being level 1 with no other noteworthy abilities. Jack's fists tightened at his sides, rage burning in his chest. He hadn't been dragged to another world just to be humiliated like this. The king declared that a level 1 wasn't even fit to serve as a foot soldier and ordered that Jack be taken away. At once, soldiers closed in from all sides, steel blades aimed at his chest. Jack clicked his tongue, reaching behind his back for something in his bag only to remember he'd left it back at the gas station. With a wry chuckle, he raised his hands in mock surrender, figuring they had the numbers anyway. The Prime Minister smirked, suggesting they might as well sell the useless bomber to the slave market. Though, he added, Jack probably wouldn't fetch much. Even in a fantasy world, the economy had no faith in him. Jack scoffed and shot back that selling him would be a waste. Plenty of people would pay handsomely for someone with his talents. That retort wiped the smirk off Vilash's face. The man stepped forward and struck Jack hard across the cheek. But the mercenary wasn't one to stay silent. Locking eyes with the Prime Minister, he warned him not to mistake him for someone who could be trampled on. Leaning in until they were eye to eye, Jack added in a low, dangerous tone that he might look harmless, but one more insult and he'd fold the man in half. Vilash's glare sharpened as he whispered whether Jack truly understood the situation he was in. Then his voice boomed through the hall, ordering the guards to teach him a lesson. The soldiers surged forward, striking the mercenary again and again. Jack didn't raise a hand to defend himself, choosing instead to endure every blow. He knew that striking back now would only make things spiral further out of control. Patience, that was the only weapon he needed for the moment. His body gave out, dropping to the floor, battered and bleeding. It felt like life itself had slapped a nasty debuff on him. Vilash approached with a smug grin, asking if the bomber had finally let some sense be beaten into him. He warned that if Jack kept his attitude, they'd start treating him like a walking execution order. Laughter erupted through the hall as if the whole scene were a cheap comedy skit. 2 guards seized Jack's arms, trying to snap handcuffs around his wrists. Glancing around, he saw nothing but mocking faces staring back at him. The mercenary's eyes hardened into a killing glare. If they wanted to look down on him, fine, but they'd regret it. With a sudden movement, he slammed an elbow into one guard, breaking free, and charged straight at the Prime Minister. His fist connected squarely with Vilash's face, sending the man crashing to the floor like a sack of grain. Blood trickled from his mouth as he groaned in pain, a perfect critical hit to his pride. Jack strode forward, calm and deliberate, drawing his gun and leveling it at Vilash's head. Without hesitation, he squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the bullet punched clean through the Prime Minister's skull. Gasps filled the chamber, the air instantly shifting from courtly spectacle to tense, deadly silence. Blood pooled beneath the fallen man's body as Jack stared down at him and muttered, almost casually, that he had told him to keep his mouth shut. The guards shouted and charged at Jack, rifles raised, but the bomber seized the nearest soldier and hauled him into position as a living shield. Gunfire erupted, and in their frenzy, the guards riddled their own comrade with bullets. When the shooting ceased, Jack exhaled sharply and let the limp body fall to the floor, quipping that they must have really hated their friend. There wasn't a drop of blood left in him. Before anyone could even blink, he surged forward like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the soldiers with ruthless precision. Heads fell, bodies dropped, and in mere seconds, the hall was littered with the dead. Those still standing froze, watching in horror. This wasn't a battle, it was a one-man massacre. Jack smirked, proudly declaring that this was only his level 1 strength. The king roared in fury, demanding to know the identity of this madman. Jack merely shrugged and told him to consider this a parting gift. He tossed something into the monarch's hands, and the instant the old man looked down, he realized it was a bomb. Jack's grin widened as he called it his business card, a bomber mercenary for hire, fee set at a cool million US. A deafening blast followed, the explosion tearing through half the palace like fireworks supercharged with malice. Guards screamed, some rushing to shield the king while others shouted that the bomber was escaping. Using the chaos to his advantage, Jack fired a grappling hook to a distant building, swinging through the smoke like an outlaw action hero before landing cleanly on a nearby rooftop. Jack chuckled under his breath, muttering that making an escape with a grappling hook felt like something straight out of a spy flick. The sound of boots pounding against stone snapped him back to the moment, and he quickly pressed himself against a wall. 2 guards rushed past, shouting that His Majesty had ordered the otherworld bomber to be executed on sight. Their orders were clear: find him at all costs, and this time, don't let him get away. Jack rubbed his forehead, irritated that the so-called king was still breathing after everything. The situation was spiraling fast, and if he was honest, it was probably his own fault for losing his temper literally. A passing vehicle caught his eye, and he couldn't help but mutter about how bizarre this world was: horses and carriages on one street, cars on the next. If he weren't busy dodging death, he'd be tempted to take one for a joyride. But for now, stealing a ride meant freedom, and freedom meant survival. He broke into a run, silently grateful for the gear he still had left. If he wanted a weapon, though, he'd likely have to pry it from the hands of heavily armed guards. Stopping mid-step, he frowned, suddenly realizing he didn't even know why he was planning an escape in the first place. He'd been summoned here, betrayed, and now treated like a criminal. The irony wasn't lost on him. This was backward, and he couldn't help but wonder if those smug fools who mocked him were still buried in the ruins of that palace. Jack's eyes narrowed, a dangerous grin tugging at his lips. There were lines in this world you simply didn't cross, and crossing Jack Aaron was at the very top of that list. Deciding it was time to put an end to the remnants of his so-called revenge party, He kicked the gate guard hard before driving a bullet into the man's stomach. Striding past without a glance back, he considered planting a bomb for good measure until something glinting in the distance caught his attention. His gaze locked on a woman standing nearby, and in a heartbeat, his gun was aimed at her. "What's that glowing thing?" he asked. She froze, voice trembling as she stammered that it was the city's core. Poor woman had just clocked in for her shift and was now face to face with a final boss. Struggling to keep calm, she explained it was a magic device controlling every magical system in the imperial capital, essentially the brain and heart of the city. Jack nodded like he understood perfectly, then casually mused aloud if it could be destroyed. The woman's eyes widened in horror as she whispered that while it was technically possible, it was the last thing anyone should attempt. The core was fragile, near impossible to replace, and in the worst case, its destruction could reduce the entire empire to dust. But all Jack seemed to hear was, "Technically, you can." She begged him not to even think about it, calling the idea madness. Unfortunately for her, Jack was already weighing the odds, thinking that if blowing it up would make his plan work better, then why not? With the same care one might use to hang an ornament, he placed one of his strongest bombs onto the city's core. Jack gave himself a slow, sarcastic clap while the woman's eyes filled with tears, her voice shaking as she whispered that this had to be a nightmare. With his gun casually aimed at her, he teased that they were practically partners in crime by now. She pleaded for her life, saying she'd already done more than enough to help him. Tilting his head in mock gratitude, Jack thanked her, then pulled the trigger. Mercy, it seemed, was never part of his toolkit. With his mischief now set in motion, he scanned the area for the perfect vantage point to enjoy the coming show. Not far away, two guards paused, sensing an odd surge of magical energy. One offered to investigate, unknowingly walking straight toward the grand finale. Before he could take another step, Jack emerged from the shadows and smashed the man's face into a wall. Turning to the second guard sprawled on the ground, he casually asked if there was a car nearby, adding it would be nice to borrow it for just a minute. Moments later, Jack was behind the wheel, tearing away from the city until he reached a safe distance. Finding the view just right, he muttered about how everyone back there had pushed him too far. "Eat this," he said, pressing the detonator. The city exploded in a roaring wave of fire, thick black smoke clawing toward the sky. Even from miles away, the heat made him instinctively step back. He stared at the burning ruins and then burst into wild, uncontrollable laughter, the kind that only grew louder the longer it lasted. The mighty empire was now nothing but ashes. Back in the present, the mercenary wrapped up his tale, explaining that this every bloody, explosive detail was why he needed a way back to his own world. He'd caught wind of a certain alchemist rumored to have the skills to help, and that rumor had led him here. The irony wasn't lost on him. Man levels a city and then comes asking for favors. He eyed the woman across from him, wondering if she might have answers. That would make things easy. But Alice only stared at him, face unreadable. She asked again, just to confirm she'd heard right. Had he really destroyed the imperial capital? Jack grinned like a man bragging about his greatest achievement and nodded without shame. Alice didn't blink, saying she wasn't in the mood for jokes. Jack gave her a thumbs up, assuring her he wasn't joking in the slightest. He figured the headlines would be catching up with him soon enough anyway. The alchemist muttered that even with the entire force of imperial mages, turning the city core into a bomb was madness. She frowned, noting she couldn't sense a shred of mana from him, and asked if he was even a magic user. Jack admitted he wasn't. He couldn't conjure a single fireball, but he had something else, something far rarer. Pulling up his status board, he let her see for herself. The moment her eyes landed on the words bomb making X++, her jaw nearly hit the floor. For the first time, she realized he hadn't been lying at all. "That's not a skill," she said flatly. "That's a walking disaster waiting to happen." She went on to explain that in skill ranks, even a meant mastery, and X was the stuff of legends. But his wasn't just X, it had 2+ signs after it. This was a talent that broke the limits of human comprehension, the kind of force that could turn impossible dreams or nightmares into reality. Jack just chuckled, admitting it sounded pretty awesome, feeling a bit smug about it now. Her glare, however, could cut steel. "You're acting like this is somebody else's problem," she snapped. "It's yours. You are the problem." He shrugged, claiming it kind of was someone else's fault after all. They gave him the ability without even bothering to promote him properly. Still, he couldn't deny he was starting to like the chaos it caused. She then pointed to a strange number on his status board, asking what it meant. Jack admitted he'd been wondering the same thing. Cue a flashback to just hours after the bombing. He'd been staring at the flaming wreck of a car, muttering that maybe he should have asked for a way home before reducing the city to rubble. But no, when he got irritated, mass destruction just seemed to happen. Oh, and to top it off, he forgot to grab cigarettes. Perfect. Letting out a roar of frustration, he shouted that if these people could summon him, they should be able to send him back. This world was already bizarre enough, especially with status boards appearing out of nowhere. Then he checked his own and almost collapsed on the spot. His level was 386. When he first arrived, he was sure his level was just 1, but now the status board read Class Bomber with a karma score of 600. Negative karma. If this were a game, he'd be the walking, talking villain side quest. The only reason he could think of for such a leap was simple. Leveling an entire city to the ground must have showered him with enough experience points to break the system. Testing his new strength, he suddenly took off at full sprint only to realize he was moving far faster than before. Even when he slammed straight into a stone wall, the impact didn't so much as bruise him. Intrigued, he yanked a rock from the wall and crushed it in his fist like a cracker. Eyes wide, he laughed out loud, so this was what leveling up did to the body. Grinning, he declared Superman could step aside. There was a new hero in town. A high leap followed, just to see if he could fly, but he landed firmly on his feet. No flight powers yet, but his jump alone could shatter Olympic records. Thrilled, he decided to scout around for the nearest town, maybe he'd even score a flashy super suit before Christmas. Side quests, after all, might be the quickest way to unlock his Marvel art.